Hello Internet, welcome to Film Theory, the show that always wishes upon a star no matter who you are. So if you've been around YouTube, you may have seen something called the Pixar theory floating around from creators like the SuperCarlinBrothers. The idea there is to take every single Pixar film and try to put them into a single story. This Pixar theory is a monumental feat, but I looked at it and thought, what if we could do something bigger? What if we could take all of Disney's main animated movies and do something similar, putting them all into a single story and creating the ultimate Disney theory. Last time we covered everything up to about the year 1900, ranging from the Big Bang and the creation of Earth all the way up to the interactions between the kingdoms we see in European fairy tales like Cinderella and The Little Mermaid. But how does all of this connect to the likes of Wreck-It Ralph, or Lilo and Stitch, or Zootopia? Well friends, today we're gonna find out. Oh, and just before we hop in, last time I asked you all which Disney princess you thought would win in a fight, Elsa, Moana, or Rapunzel. And let me tell you loyal theorists, y'all delivered. This was my highest commented video ever, and the top 5 highest commented videos of film theory this year. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and really thoughtful reasoning on this whole subject. You guys are awesome. So, who did you think would win? Well, the audience pick by a landslide, or rather an avalanche, was Elsa, mostly due to her ice powers. And hey, you know what? That makes sense. I can see it. She got so many votes that we scrolled for 10 minutes trying to count up how many she had, and it crashed YouTube's backend before we were able to count them all up. In the end, she tallied up 5,030 votes. Wild! As for second place, it was a surprisingly tight race between Moana and Rapunzel, but Moana just squeaked out a victory. A lot of votes were also put in before people had a chance to see Moana 2, and I wonder if that would have impacted things. Either way, this was a super fun experiment, and I definitely think we should do this Disney Princess Battle Royale theory someday. After all, I wonder how the likes of Mulan, or Merida, or Raya would do, or if someone like Snow White or Cinderella could eke out a win. I mean, probably not on that one, but hey, it's a fun idea. Anyway, thank you again for your help on this, and with all of that said, let's jump back into the Disney theory. So last time we stopped off with The Jungle Book in the 1890s, but there's so much more to go. For instance, it's here where we come to another pivotal moment in the Disneyverse just from the sheer amount of important elements that all happened in one place, Pinocchio, which takes place in Italy. We can also pin this one down to the 1890s thanks to the Ferris wheel we see in the amusement park, and thankfully, this lines up with a lot of other evidence we see from the Disney canon. For instance, we can see one of Geppetto's earlier puppets in Corona during the events of Tangled about 50 years before, which checks out with just how old Geppetto would be at this point. But an even more significant connection might be to a movie you're not expecting, The Emperor's New Groove. Think about it, the Pleasure Island operation we see in Pinocchio is built on potions that transform boys into donkeys. Sound familiar? Pinocchio even takes place when Peru and Italy expanded their trade relationship in the real world. And we know that a number of the donkeys get shipped to salt mines. As it turns out, Peru is home to one of the longest running salt mines on the planet, which uses donkeys to this very day. So, you heard it here, the potion that transforms the kids in Pinocchio is the same one from The Emperor's New Groove. Whew, that one took a lot to find the date, but thankfully our next entry makes things super easy. Rounding out the 1800s, we have The Great Mouse Detective, set in London during 1897, which we know thanks to a date on a handy newspaper. This movie is also the closest we're ever going to get to a Disney animated Sherlock Holmes, which makes me sad. I'd love to see that personally. But there's no need to dwell on that, just like there's no need to dwell on Make Mine Music, a collection of animated shorts, most of which are set in America. This bad boy's not even on Disney Plus, but it's part of the Disney canon, so we gotta count it. Most of the shorts are dotted across the first half of the 1900s, and they don't really leave much of an impact, so yeah, moving on. Just like The Great Mouse Detective, the next movie in the timeline also prominently features the Big Ben Clock Tower. I'm of course talking about Peter Pan, set in 1904 as confirmed in the film's pre-release promotional material.
Here, the city of London, back in 1904.
This film also once again goes hard on the magic of wishes and belief in fairies. There's a reason it's a Disney classic. A movie that didn't leave much of an impact though, The Wind in the Willows from The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This story was about some talking toads that takes place basically at the same time as Peter Pan in the English countryside, just a year later in 1905, which we know thanks to a dated invoice. And just like The Great Mouse Detective, it's another case of a sentient human-animal creature. Just thought I'd point that out, it will become relevant later. Heading across the pond, we actually have to make a pit stop in San Francisco. Here, a scientist named Lenore Shimamoto was experimenting with some sort of new power source. But her invention inadvertently amplified the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake enough that it became known as just the Great Catastrophe. Thankfully, the city was rebuilt with the help of Japanese immigrants, whose influence on the city had it redubbed as San Fransokyo. But here's the thing, the The power source that Shimamoto was creating? It was a star!
It created a star.
A star?
Yeah, she was trying to harness the same star magic that set the Disneyverse on this wildly different path. The same stuff I assume the Atlanteans got their hands on and blew up like the whole world. Just goes to show how powerful this stuff is and how it continued to alter the Disneyverse even this far along the timeline. Heading over to New Orleans, we have Lady and the Tramp, which mostly takes place in 1908 based on a calendar marking a baby's delivery date. April of 1908 was the only month around this time that had April 1st fall on a Wednesday. And before we take a break from our animal-centric movies, we have to head from the French Quarter to France itself, where we have the Aristocats, set in Paris in the year 1910. Again, you just have to love it when they make it easy with these superimposed texts. We love it, it's great. Something that was not as easy though? Well, we're gonna put Tarzan in Africa also in the year 1910. Why would this one be hard? Well, first off, there's a popular theory floating around online that Tarzan's parents are actually King Agnar and Queen Iduna from Frozen. One of Frozen's co-directors actually has this headcanon themselves. But that doesn't really line up with the other things we know about these movies. For instance, it's said that the parents in Frozen were sailing to attend a wedding, the wedding of Rapunzel and Eugene from Tangled, which we've established takes place in Western or Central Europe. If the Frozen parents were coming from Norway to go to that wedding, why would they be close enough to Central Africa to wash up and build a house there? And secondly, honestly, I just don't see the resemblance here. We physically see all four of the parents in these films, and I just don't think that they look enough alike to make up for the difference in geography. And also, as we're about to see, the timeline it doesn't match up. So, okay, that gets us away from Frozen, but what else is the problem? Well, Jane and her father mentioned that Tarzan should meet a number of famous people back in England.
Darwin and Kipling, Queen Victoria!
But the problem here is that there was no point where all of these people would have been both alive and famous at the same time. Darwin died in 1882, years before Kipling published the works that would earn him his fame. What's more, there's also projector slides featuring the Eiffel Tower, which wasn't completed until 1889, and an airplane which wasn't invented until 1903. Basically, this whole movie's a bit of a timey-wimey mess, so to land on our date here, we're going to go with the latest possible time that it could take place. And we get that thanks to The Legend of Tarzan, the animated series spin-off of the film. In one episode, Tarzan meets US President Teddy Roosevelt during his famous year-long African expedition that concluded in 1910. So, in the same way that there were small changes thanks to the star magic in the Disneyverse, we're gonna say that a lot of the lifespans of a few historical figures got extended. Queen Victoria gets to see her 90th birthday, and Charles Darwin lasts the ripe old age of 100.
You've read Darwin, it's called natural selection.
Perfect segue, because that brings us to the main events of Atlantis: The Lost Empire, set in 1914 per the superimposed text at the start of the film. Easy, we love it. This movie really shows us how the development of technology has also been enhanced by the influence of star magic. Though submarines existed in the real world as early as the 1620s, the subs in World War I were nowhere near what we see in Atlantis. And trust me, things get much crazier later on because of this. But for now, we have to head back to New Orleans for the events of The Princess and the Frog. This is set in 1926, which we know thanks to a newspaper, and shows us yet another case of magic turning people like Tiana and Naveen into animals. And in a slightly different case of talking animals, we then have both Winnie the Pooh and the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Just like the books they're based on, these films take place in the 1920s, though Christopher Robin's imagination is the magic that brought Pooh and his friends to life in this case. Then The Fox and the Hound is set in the rural United States, probably in the 1930s, based on the technology we see in the sequel, because, of course, there's a Fox and the Hound 2. Is nothing sacred? I guess not, because then there's Peter Pan: Return to Neverland, set in London during 1941. We know this because it takes place during the Blitz, the World War II bombing campaign against the United Kingdom. And around the same time, there's Dumbo and Bambi, both set in the United States around the time of their release, 1941 and 1942 respectively. Up next, there's a bit of an interesting case. At the same time, we have the films Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, and Fun and Fancy Free, all of which take place in roughly the mid-1940s. Just like The Black Cauldron, I figured that these would be very difficult to place because they so heavily feature societies full of humanoid animals similar to The Sorcerer's Apprentice. But other films don't have those characters or peoples as widespread, if at all. Well, the solution was quite obvious. Fun and Fancy Free introduces the idea that these films with these characters are literally stories being told or heard in-universe by Jiminy Cricket. That's what's happening here. It's just like The Matrix, we're 2 layers deep with these films and their segments being stories inside of the Disneyverse, likely influenced by stories or historical records of stuff like The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Now, I know that we've been glossing over most of the sequels unless they were main movies like Frozen 2, or they were needed to help place a film in our timeline here, but we have to talk about Atlantis again. Yeah, the direct-to-video sequel Atlantis, Milo's Return, takes place in the 1940s after World War II, over 30 years after the main events of the first film. The movie also ends with Atlantis returning to the surface, which will have a big impact on technology in the future. Trust me, we'll get there. Oh, and also, just before we move on, Atlantis 2 also lets us slide in the classic Disney animated series Gargoyles into the timeline. See, Milo's Return was originally going to be a spin-off series called Team Atlantis, which was canceled after The Lost Empire bombed at the box office. Well, one of the episodes of Team Atlantis was going to feature Demona, a main antagonist from Gargoyles. And this wasn't just like a random idea they had a script done. This basically opens up all of the mythology touched by Gargoyles and fits it into the Disneyverse, including their versions of Odin, Puck, King Arthur, and Avalon. Guess the kid from Sword in the Stone had a major glow-up, didn't he? Honestly, this one is just a bit of selfish Lee content because Gargoyles was such a formative part of my childhood. This might not fit 100% with everything else here, but just let me have this one, okay? Something that is clear and does fit in, though, Encanto, with all of its star magic packed inside of the casita, is up next, set in 1950s Colombia. This is 50 years after the Madrigal family fled their home due to some sort of Colombian conflict, likely the Thousand Days War, which happened around the year 1900. Bruno also references telenovelas, which didn't really become a thing until the 50s, so it fits.
So what do you like? What do you like? You like sports?
Game show.
Telenovelas.
And a thing that was also around in the 50s? Dalmatians. Over 100 of them, in fact. Yeah, right after Encanto, we have 101 Dalmatians set in London, though the date's a bit funky. Why? Well, we see a calendar that suggests 1954, but a newspaper that states 1958. It's possible that someone could have had a calendar that long that was just out of date, but just to be on the safe side, we're actually going to place this movie and its sequel in late 1960 and early 1961. This is because its sequel, 101 Dalmatians 2, Patch's London Adventure, has multiple newspapers from 1961. Also, real quick, it's just truly tragic they didn't name this sequel 102 Dalmatians. Like, that title is one of the few things a live-action remake did better than the animation. Continuing our trend of classic animal movies, next up we have The Rescuer, set during the time of its release in 1977, with the bulk of the story taking place in a Louisiana bayou. Man, Louisiana in the Disneyverse gets real busy, doesn't it? Anyway, we also know that the sequel, The Rescuers Down Under, takes place in Australia during 1979, all thanks to this shot of a calendar. It also lines up with the fact that Bernard and Bianca get engaged in this movie, and marriage proposals typically happen after about 2.5 years of dating. The timeline just matches perfectly, even if we are talking about a movie with talking mice and a grand mouse society. But counter to that, we also have some pretty normal animals living in human society, like those we see in Oliver and Company. This film is set in New York City in 1988, the year it was released, which we can confirm thanks to another calendar. Also, before you mention it, yes, this movie does have a lot of familiar-looking dogs from other Disney films, but we know that they're not the same animals and that they can't live that long, so we're just gonna chalk this up to animals of the same breed and same species just looking similar. I mean, it's like not every deer can be Bambi's mom, even if the animation is copied wholesale. And from here, we're actually done with the 20th century. Well, unless you want to count Gargoyles, the lion's share of which takes place in the 90s, but again, that's some selfish Lee content. But regardless, now, moving into the 21st century, we have a movie that's going to introduce a lot of big ideas for the Disneyverse. See, Earth was not the only planet in the Disneyverse to have life develop on it, or technology supercharged by star magic. No, there's actually tons of these, enough to form a government in the Milky Way galaxy known as the United Galactic Federation. This is a powerful faction who keep an eye over thousands of planets and have laws against certain science that would go against the natural order of things, the natural way of star magic. They believe this so much that by the year 2001, they arrest Dr. Jumba Jukaba for creating a new species and seek to destroy his work.
It is an affront to nature. It must be destroyed.
How do we know all this? Well, it's all thanks to Lilo and Stitch. Yeah, we see the Galactic Federation in action in this movie, and we know that it takes place in the year 2001 thanks to the date that we see on Stitch's adoption paper after he escapes to Earth and starts his life on Hawaii. Also worth noting that Earth's history with weird sentient animal creatures is kind of on display in this movie. Like, very few people people call out how weird the aliens look when they're visiting Earth and they've put on some very bad disguises. People are just being polite. After all, this is a planet that's had everything from dragons to talking mice to giant talking mice. Anyway, the existence of this Galactic Federation has some pretty wild implications later on, but for now, well, even with the boost from Atlantis, the technology on Earth has a bit more to go before it can catch up with this Galactic Federation, but that doesn't mean it isn't impressive. Why do I say that? Well, because of Meet the Robinsons. Yeah, I forgot about this one too, but this movie starts in the year 2007 before we have a 30-year time jump giving us a glimpse into the future. This is spelled out pretty clearly in the film's marketing. Anyway, this film involves a lot of time travel, which allows its main character Lewis to see where technology is headed and really help further accelerate scientific development when he goes back to 2007. Man, time travel always complicates things, doesn't it? Something less complicated, though, is Bolt, set around its release date in 2008. Nothing super eventful there. But more eventfully, around this time, we also have Wreck-It Ralph and Ralph Breaks the Internet, set at roughly the same times as their release dates, 2012 and 2018 respectively. The sequel even acknowledges the 6-year time difference.
Look, I get it. You've been married 6 years. You're looking to spice things up.
This shows us that technology has advanced more quickly than in our world, enough so that characters in video games and online are sentient. Though I will say these movies are a bit weird in the context of the Disneyverse. After all, Ralph Breaks the Internet confirms that the Walt Disney Company straight up exists in the Disneyverse, along with the Disney princesses, Pixar, Marvel, Star Wars, and the Muppets. And while that is a weird quirk, it's not exactly impossible. Like, Disney could exist in the Disneyverse, creating films and merch and attractions based off of real-world history. So instead of making movies about fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and the rest, they're just making movies based on the true stories of Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella and the rest. They even go as far as to straight up joke about this in some of their movies.
I like to see the movie they make about you now.
I just hope they stay true to what really happened.
They might even make a motion picture about you.
And honestly, this isn't even unprecedented in Disney's sphere. A fictional version of Marvel Comics literally exists in the main Marvel continuity, publishing comics based on the adventures of the characters that exist in that universe. It's fun and it's weird and it's meta, but it's not universe breaking. Speaking of superheroes though, we now have to fast forward to the main events of Big Hero 6, set all the way in 2032. We know this because there are posters in the film pointing out that it's the 95th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge's opening. The bridge finished construction in 1937, so 95 years later would be 2032. This movie is our first real look at just how far advanced the technology in the Disneyverse has gotten thanks to the advancements of Atlantis and the star magic. This movie gives us AI, fully functional robots, and tech advanced enough for there to be legitimate superheroes in the world all by the 2030s. Then, just to wrap up this part, we gotta return to 2037 and the future we saw in Meet the Robinsons. There's a lot of similar yet just slightly more advanced tech here as compared to Big Hero 6, but the biggest thing that stuck out to me, it seems like technology has gotten good enough to infuse regular animals with star magic that lets them speak, as we see with the genetically engineered frogs in this film.
Hey Frankie baby, you gotta tell us one of your jokes.
Man, this movie sure was, it was something. Okay, so now here is where things get huge, wild, and crazy. Yeah, we're gonna see a massive time jump between Meet the Robinsons in 2037 and the next films in the Disneyverse timeline, and in that time frame, there are some big changes to the world, to the whole galaxy. See, at some point, humanity must achieve interstellar travel and join the rest of the aliens up there in the stars. In fact, eventually, humanity leaves Earth altogether, and we know this thanks to what I'm gonna call the animal people movies. You know the ones. They have very humanoid-looking animals walking upright like they're people. At first, I wondered if they were on their own planet, but we know that these humanoid animal movies have to take place on Earth.
Looked on all the other planets, you can only find them right here on Earth.
So, how is that possibly going to fit? Well, if humanity leaves Earth and expands out into space with the Galactic Federation, that would give the sentient animals a chance to rise up and be the new people of Earth. And we actually know that this is something that some of the talking animals on Earth have wanted for a while. In the Jungle Book, King Louie explains,
I want to be like you.
When I'm human, as I hope to be.
And in Wish, the goat goes even further.
I dream of a utopian metropolis where all mammals are equal and wear clothes.
So, now that humanity has gone on to greener pastures in the stars, the talking animals take the chance to make Earth their own, where they can evolve into their own societies and eventually become more humanoid. Early on, they look a bit like civilizations from Earth's past, and even reuse old names for their peoples and their governments. This is where we find Robin Hood in our timeline. During this period, a lot of predators from the top of the food chain are in charge, like the lions King Richard and Prince John. I mean, heck, even Robin Hood and Maid Marian are foxes. This ingrains a lot of prejudice into this society, even hundreds of years later. Like in Chicken Little, where a fox bullies Chicken Little and his friends, and in Zootopia, where a lion is elected mayor, though predators are often stereotyped as violent. Thankfully, by the end of that movie, they do seem to be working towards a more equal society, which is great. You love to see it. And just the cherry on top of this, we know that this strange version of Earth full of talking animals is a bit of a tourist destination for aliens in the Galactic Federation.
We stop here every summer on the way to the in-laws.
Every year.
Yeah, we see in Chicken Little that some animals come by this planet every year, like it's an apple orchard or amusement park. But perhaps they should have been focusing their attention elsewhere, because at some point, this entire Galactic Federation must collapse or change drastically. Perhaps this was due to some sort of galactic-wide catastrophe, maybe some sort of civil war. We just don't have enough information to say. But what we can say for sure, space pirates took advantage of this chaos with the likes of Captain Nathaniel Flint gathering a vast hoard of treasure and hiding it on planets throughout the galaxy, while the remnants of the Federation likely reformed into some sort of monarchy with a navy and interstellar academy to train new recruits. But why do I say all of this? Well, because the Galactic Federation we see in Lilo and Stitch is nothing like the galaxy we see in the last film in our timeline, Treasure Planet. Yeah, the super stylized technology and universe of this movie with all of its classic nautical ships and imagery is a far cry from the sleek sci-fi designs of Lilo and Stitch. Oh, and we know that bit about the monarchy rising up thanks to ships like the RLS Legacy. According to the spin-off game Treasure Planet Battle at Procyon, the ship prefix RLS stands for Royal Light Ship. Royal as in royalty, a king or queen. And yes, we know that all of this has to be part of the same timeline as the Federation we see in Lilo and Stitch, because the young Jim Hawkins has a plush doll of Stitch in his room, meaning that the adventures of Experiment 626 must be well known enough in this world to become merchandisable. You know, real talk aside here, but Treasure Planet has always been in my top 3 favorite Disney animations. I wish it was more successful and we got more of it, but alas. And from here, well, there's nothing else. That's the entire Disney theory so far. The entire story of the Disneyverse by piecing together all of their movies and as best a way we could. Is some of it a bit janky? Yeah, there are a lot of films here with a lot of similar but slightly different ideas. But I think we did a really good job here. Our team, our editors and researchers really crushed it on this just massive project. And honestly, this was just so much fun, and I can't wait to see where the future movies fit into the Disney theory. But until Disney releases a new movie, remember that it's all just a theory. A film theory. And cut. Up next on Film Theory.
I am dissecting every major Disney movie to determine once and for all which is the deadliest of all the Disney movies. And, if I can swing it, what is the overall total kill count for the entire Disney canon?